Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Looks like we have some people joining us. Thanks, everyone. We only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for an exciting session on using social media as a tool for activism. My name is Ari, and I'm our social media manager at Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Action. I'm responsible for overseeing our national social media strategy and providing support to our organizers and staff who are managing our regional social media presence. The goal of this session today is to help all of you learn how to effectively explain big, complex environmental issues in an accessible and engaging way, and how to increase your engagement on social media. Before we get started, I'd also like to introduce my colleague and our Food and Water Watch and Action social media coordinator, Yonit Friedman, who writes our daily social media posts for our national Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Since many of us are probably working in, volunteering, or connected to environmental issues, our conversation today will be focused around finding creative and engaging ways to present these sometimes nuanced and interconnected topics. It sometimes can be difficult to communicate effectively without sounding too wonky, but hopefully these tips today will help.
We are also thrilled to be joined today by Jessica Kletchka, a climate justice activist. With a background in psychology and environmental justice, Jessica is an expert at explaining and using social media as a platform to inspire others to take action on critical environmental issues. Jessica will be sharing some tips with us on how to effectively talk about climate change on social media in a way that will draw in your audience. This is a skill that's equally important to an individual posting on their personal accounts to raise awareness among your friends, your family members, or your colleagues, as it is here for those of us today who manage a nonprofit or organizational social media account. So now, without further ado, let's turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica, and I'm a climate justice activist, climate change educator, and writer. I'm from Poland originally, and I'm now based in Wales in the UK. Just a little bit about my work. I got involved in climate activism during my psychology degree in London, and I initially started researching which personality traits lead to pro-environmental behavior. And I then realized that it's not so much about who we are, but the messaging we're exposed to and the kind of environments we find ourselves in. So I decided that I didn't want to work as a psychologist, and I pursued a master's degree in climate change impact and adaptation, where I focused on climate change communication and the role of values in pro-environmental behavior and systems change. The interesting thing about values is that they're fluid, and they can change depending on who we spend time with, where we work or study, or even depending on the media we consume. How we communicate climate change is of crucial importance if we want to shift people's values towards those which favor environmental protection, degrowth, and a shift away from capitalism. I've also been involved with a range of environmental organizations against new fossil fuel development and raising awareness of environmental racism, indigenous land rights, and a variety of other causes. At the end of this month, I'll start working for Green Alliance, which is the leading environmental think tank in the UK, to bridge the gap between science and government action. Next slide, please. So climate change communication is extremely important because we still see very high rates of climate denial. A recent survey in the UK showed that only 38% of people believe that climate change is primarily caused by human activity, and that figure is similar in the United States. Climate denial has a long history, especially in the US, and since the early days of climate change science in the 1960s, the fossil fuel industry has paid scientists to produce studies which play down or deny the effects or even the reality of climate change. This is still happening today, with the most prominent example being the Heartland Institute, but nowadays, luckily, it's happening on a much smaller scale. Climate denial is most often fueled by misinformation in the media, and many news channels give a disproportionate amount of airtime to denialist views as opposed to legit scientists, although denialist views represent less than 1% of scientific opinion. The recent IPCC report has stated that climate change is unequivocally caused by human activity, which is a very strong statement. So usually we have a slight error margin in science, but we're pretty sure about this. Climate change now has many different facets today, and it does not necessarily mean an outright denial that climate change is real. Only 1% of people in the UK believe that the climate is not changing, and only about 5% of people in the US. This number used to be a lot higher, but we can thank the rigorous research of the IPCC report and the work of climate activists and public figures such as Al Gore in the US for rapidly changing public opinion in recent decades. However, climate denial manifests in more insidious ways these days, and these three are the most common ones. Firstly, greenwashing. Greenwashing basically means that companies pretend to be more environmentally friendly than they actually are. For example, if you look at Shell or Exxon's Instagram, for example, pretty much everything they talk about is how much carbon they're sucking out of the atmosphere, how many sustainable initiatives they're part of, and it's a really warped picture which doesn't really take into account the harm they're causing to ecosystems and communities. Secondly, wakewashing is a more recent strategy in which the fossil fuel industry capitalized on the rise of environmental justice movements. A lot of the people featured in fossil fuel ads and their social media accounts are people of color, which completely disregards the fact that those communities are most affected by environmental racism and land degradation perpetrated by those industries. Lastly, climate delay is often employed by industries and corporations to make the climate crisis seem less urgent than it actually is. This strategy often happens in tandem between industries and government, which ultimately means that governments don't follow up on their climate action goals. To illustrate that, the UK government has one of the most ambitious emission reduction targets in the world. I believe it's 78% by 2030. But our actual policies reduce CO2 emissions at only a quarter of the rate that they should. And as it stands, the UK investments in the green recovery per capita is only a very small fraction of that of the United States, which would have been unthinkable just a year ago. And it really shows that radical changes in policy are possible on a fairly short timescale. Next slide, please. It's important to note that misinformation is not the only factor contributing to climate denial. And that's when we need to talk about climate doomism. I do a lot of climate communication work on social media, and how we frame our messages is super important if we want to ensure that people act upon them. The reason I introduced this talk speaking about climate denial, apart from the fact that it's important to recognize and understand it, is that climate doomism is in fact a type of climate denial. And many media outlets and corporations engage in doomism to discourage people from acting on the climate crisis. Next slide, please. After the recent IPCC report, we saw a lot of climate doomism in the media, as these headlines demonstrate. This is a post I made on Instagram a few weeks back, and I just want to invite you to have a brief look for a moment and register how they make you feel. Now we're going to compare these to some more nuanced headlines. That's great, thank you. As a climate activist, it can be very tempting to sound the alarm bell, and we have a lot of reasons to do so. However, from a psychological perspective, this can often be counterproductive. Climate change is an existential threat, but from an evolutionary perspective, we've evolved to react to threats in three specific typical ways. Next slide, please. And those reactions are categorized as fight, flight, and freeze reactions. When we engage in climate doomism, our audience is very likely to react in one of these three ways, or a combination of them, depending on their personal history, their current environmental factors, and even genetic factors. Here we can see some examples. For instance, a lot of people still engage in the flight response. This can be climate denial, but it can also be avoidance of the topic or distraction. This could look like extreme materialism, climbing the corporate ladder, or claiming that you're too busy to engage with climate change. And this is the response most of us will be familiar with. Other people may fight and dedicate themselves to activism to the point of burnout. Those people might themselves engage in doomist messaging, and they can be labeled aggressive, alarmist, and judgmental by other people. Also, putting long hours into activism is not sustainable. I've been there myself. I've suffered from burnout, and it's really not contributing to the cause at all. Very often, people experience the freeze response, which often comes with detrimental effects on their mental health. People may be overwhelmed and unable to act. And in this state, we can experience conditions such as eco-anxiety, which many of you might be familiar with, depression, grief, and despair. Again, they're all not very conducive to action. Next slide, please. So how are we supposed to communicate climate change on social media? It can be a tricky one, but from a psychological point of view, these three factors are the most important ones. Firstly, focus on possibilities rather than threats. Activism works, and whenever a success happens, it's really important to celebrate it. For example, in early 2020, I joined Extinction Rebellion in blocking a coal mine in England. And as a result, plans for an expansion of the coal mine were dropped. This is only one example of many I've personally witnessed, and I think it's really important to be vocal about those victories in order to inspire other people. Secondly, this is a bit cliche, but be hopeful. People are a lot more inspired by hope rather than fear. And while it's important to stress the threat that climate change poses, our focus should be on what we can do about it. And lastly, hold the media accountable. Humans have evolved to pay more attention to negative messaging as a survival instinct, and the media really relentlessly exploit this fact. There's a lot of power in complaining to the media as a member of the public for the ways in which they frame and relay the climate crisis. And if you work in media, you can also use this knowledge to push for change within the industry. Next slide, please. Lastly, when we talk about communicating climate change on social media, it's really important to make it accessible. For those of us who work in the environmental sector or engage in activism, it can be really easy to forget that most people don't understand climate change very well. And this is why I want to conclude this talk with a few simple rules or tips for using social media as a tool to spread the climate message. Firstly, make it relevant. We probably all know the saying, think global, act local, but actually from a psychological perspective, this is not necessarily true when it comes to climate action. People are a lot more likely to start caring about global climate change when they see its effects on a local scale. And therefore, it's very important to get people involved in their local communities. For example, this can look like maintaining the local park or protecting a local endangered species. And this can then often spill over and develop into more wide-reaching action and activism. Secondly, be concise. We're constantly bombarded with information from many different sources, and our capacity to absorb new information is very limited. As a starting point, it's important to explain climate science in simple terms and then link to resources explaining it more in depth. Thirdly, avoid confusing terminology. Accessible language is everything when we want to include more people in the climate movement. For example, instead of carbon sequestration, you can say sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, or just make sure you define this term first before you use it in any context. I found climatejargon.ie a really great resource, and they basically explain common climate terms in plain English, and I've linked them here on this slide. Next, make your communication action-oriented. Start on a small scale with accessible actions, for example, changing your bank or who you vote for. For people who are more open and able to change their lifestyle, you can suggest more challenging actions such as changing one's diet or driving less. For those who are open to contributing both time and effort, you can suggest joining a local campaign group or starting their own campaign group. Lastly, and most importantly, we have to listen to our audience and other people. Find out what people's barriers are in engaging with climate change and shape your communication around them. For example, I did that with question stickers on my Instagram stories, and I just asked people, what do you perceive as the biggest barriers? It's important to remember that every single one of us is an influencer. It doesn't matter whether you have thousands of followers, whether you're a school teacher, for example, or whether you just talk about climate change at family gatherings. People have always been influenced by other people's opinions and knowledge, and all of us have our own spheres of influence. So it's all about learning what your spheres are and how to use them. That's pretty much all from me. I want to end by recommending some great climate communicators, which you could learn a lot from. I've certainly learned a lot from them. Next slide, please. Our Changing Climate on YouTube is a really great channel, very accessible and well-researched, and it's about all things climate, so definitely check them out. Next slide, please. Some really good accounts on Instagram you should follow. Intersectional environmentalists talk a lot about the intersections of climate and social justice, and I personally learned a lot from them. Curious Earth is an environmental news magazine, which I write for as well, and they often visualize environmental news on their Instagram. Queer Brown Vegan, also a very accessible environmental educator I've learned a lot from. Next slide, please. Earthrise Studio, a very interesting multimedia platform. Bad Activist Collective, a great resource for activists who want to move away from perfectionism and make their activism more real and more sustainable. And also, if you want to learn more about climate psychology, eco-psychology, connection with nature, and climate change communication, you can also follow me on Instagram at Jessica Kletschka. Next slide, please. Personally, my favorite podcast is the Yak's podcast. Michaela and Joe are really great activists and human beings, and they present intersectional environmental issues in a very accessible way. Very good for those new to the environmental movement, and also those not so new to the environmental movement. I want to end with some book recommendations. Firstly, Merchants of Doubt is all about how the fossil fuel industry paid scientists to come up with climate denialist research, which I talked about earlier. The second book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, is an amazing resource all about the psychological reasons for climate denial, which really helped me with my personal research. How to Save Our Planet is a collection of climate action points, from very easy and accessible ones all the way to more time-consuming and wide-reaching actions. And lastly, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety is a really good resource for activists who want to learn how to make their activism more sustainable and look after their mental health while doing so. That's it from me. Thank you so much for listening, and I really hope that my contribution will be helpful in shaping your climate change communication on social media. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was amazing. And we have lots of great comments and questions in the chat. I just want to close us out by saying that using digital channels and engaging copy and creative can really help you organize and win the fights that you're passionate about. Jessica has shared some great strategies and examples of how everyone can do this on their own social media pages. And we hope that this session leaves you empowered to do so. Some of you may volunteer or work for an environmental organization, but if you don't, this is something that you can do on your own personal pages too. Social media is definitely a powerful tool to drive awareness and action, and we hope that you're leaving this session today with sharper tools for your digital organizing toolbox. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of our 2021 virtual conference and benefit. Thank you.